Hello, this is Professor Keith Ross from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. This is another one of a series of lectures for my college classes. This one is going to be for my corrections class, and this is going to be Chapter 4 from the textbook, Jails and Detention Centers. So basically, what we're talking about is sort of an extension of what was in Chapter 3. Chapter 3, although there wasn't a lecture, I provided notes, and what we were talking about there was plenty of litigation on jails and how jails operate, that they have to provide inmates convicted and or detained, and we're going to make a distinction between those two in this lecture. That they have to have some First Amendment rights, there has to be Fourth Amendment rights, Sixth Amendment rights, and Eighth Amendment rights. When we're talking about First Amendment rights, really more we're talking about freedom of speech rights, freedom of religion. For Fourth Amendment, obviously, what are privacy interests? Where do you have a privacy interest in if you are an inmate? Sixth Amendment issues really more focused on providing counsel, providing an attorney, or providing the means to either get an attorney or to research your case legally as well. And obviously, the Eighth Amendment is definitely in the purview of corrections because it talks about what cruel and unusual punishment. I'm not going to talk about the evolution of jails. We've done enough history, so I'm really going to start with slide number 5 and 6. Let's talk about the modern day era of jails. So the modern jail, it is a confinement facility, meaning you are in custody. You are in the court's custody. You are not free to leave. Now, when we say that it's confinement, can't leave, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have been convicted. You could be awaiting trial, not make bail, and if you cannot make bail, you will be confined, or the word here would be actually detained. So let's make a distinction between being detained and being convicted. Operated and controlled by county level enforcement. One of the other things that I want to be very particular about is when we use the term jails and the term prisons. They are two different things. So if we're talking about jails, it's operated on a county or a city level. So hearkening back to the very first lesson, we know something about jails. That if a person is convicted of an offense and they are sentenced to jail, they were either sentenced with a misdemeanor up to 1 year or a violation, which depending on the jurisdictions, we'll talk New York State, up to 15 days. Designed to hold people who are either awaiting adjudication, so these are the detainees that couldn't make bail, but they're waiting for adjudication. They're waiting for their trial. They're waiting for the judge or the jury to render a verdict, and that verdict would be guilty or not guilty. Typically, the first point of entry into the criminal justice system. At least in the corrections world, yes, because you could be detained in jail and your trial is for a felony. Now, if you were convicted of the felony, you're not going to serve that sentence in the jail you were detained at. You will serve that sentence in prison. And that's on a state or possibly a federal level. Fluctuating jail populations. There is a bit of flow in and out of a jail facility, especially with what is going on in today's zeitgeist, where we're really, really focused on rehabilitation and not so focused on this idea of incapacitation and retribution. Many people who are arrested are released within 2 to 3 days. That's usually arraignment. Offenders who serve jail terms do so for 1 year or less. Again, jails, misdemeanors, and or violations up to 1 year. There is a trend for jails to have fewer inmates. Between 10 million and 15 million persons enter and exit jail facilities in the United States. I would probably figure that that number is really starting to decrease now, with a lot of major urban centers deciding not to judges deciding at arraignment to not even offer bail. I'm not going to really go into slide number 8. It's just stats. No, slide number 9, rural jails. Now, when we're talking rural, we're talking, we're not talking urban centers. We're not even talking suburbs. So this is sort of like farmland, stuff like that. Now, typically, a person who lives in a rural area tends to not have the economic power of a person that might live in an urban center. So they're not making as much money. Cost of living might be lower as well, but they're not making as much money. And if they're not making as much money, their taxable base is less too. So they're making less money and they're contributing less money to their economy. So in these rural governments, rural jails, rural correction system, rural police departments, there are tight budgets and there could be very limited staff training. I know for a fact that these very small towns upstate, where we're talking, let's say, police departments of 10, 12 sworn full-time officers, they might even have part-time officers, and the same thing on the corrections level, where maybe, we're talking about a jail that has 10 cells and maybe has 5 or 6 full-time sworn correctional officers. If you have a department that small, you don't have a training section, you don't have a training bureau, so you're dependent upon the state to provide training if and when they do. These tend to be substandard conditions. Less money means less money to upkeep these jails. Incentive to use alternative to jail incarceration, but difficult solution. So someone commits an offense. Well, what do you do with them? Well, they get arraigned. Let's say they can't make bail. Do we want to overcrowd? And this is really an issue that was dealt with in Chapter 3, and we're going to continue to deal with this idea that if you overcrowd a jail, basically what could this be interpreted as at the courts? It could be interpreted as unconstitutional because it's cruel and unusual punishment. This last bullet point is sort of interesting. State payments to local jails may create a paradox for officials who then aim to keep the jails full. Meaning, what happens is that the state, obviously, state collects taxes, states pay out taxes to various jurisdictions within that state. The rural areas are no different. So they'll pay per inmate. So if we have more inmates, they'll pay more. If we have less inmates, they'll pay less. So that's where this paradox comes. Because if we want to keep on getting that state money, well, maybe we have to keep our jails full at capacity. Metropolitan jail systems, we're talking major urban centers, New York, Boston, Chicago, Houston, LA, things like that. Large and diverse populations. In New York City, we have a population of about 8 million people. And there are just various differing populations. I mean, one of the truisms of life is that the most ethnically diverse place on planet Earth is the borough of Queens, that I believe that there is 135 recognized spoken languages in Queens alone, which means that there's at least 135 different cultures that are acculturating possibly into New York City. So we have these large and diverse populations in these major urban centers. Many offenders have substance abuse issues, mental health issues, and or medical issues. One of the things that I want to point out, and I'll probably continue to say this throughout the lectures for my corrections class, is that don't separate these two. Where you don't things don't operate in a vacuum, meaning that just because a person has substance abuse issues does not mean that that person doesn't have mental health issues. As a matter of fact, if a person has mental health issues, what we're really talking about is we're talking about brain chemistry here, and that there is some sort of chemical imbalance. This is a very, really quick and pedestrian way to illustrate it, but I just want to bring up this point. So What we're talking about, if there are mental health issues, and you know there's this chemical imbalance in the brain. Well, what does substance abuse do? Things like crack, heroin, maybe even prescription drugs like oxycontin, stuff like that. Well, what does that do? Well, that tends to also alter brain chemistry. And not only is it altering brain chemistry, but what happens if someone decides they don't want to do that stuff anymore and they start detoxing? Well, now the brain, the chemical imbalance gets really out of whack. Many jails operate near capacity. Now, when this book was written in 2016. In the last 4 years, especially in New York, there has been a significant decrease in the populations of the jails. Many offenders know each other. They might know each other through their neighborhoods, or they might know each other through the correctional system, that maybe they've been there before. Roughly 10% of offender population commits about 50% of the crimes in a local jurisdiction. Many petty and small time offenders may be homeless. I do know that about 10 years ago, homeless people would probably, not probably, there would be some times where an indigent person would prefer going to Rikers to going into the shelters. They felt safer, and the food was probably better. Modular direct supervision jails, rounded architecture for living units. Basically, what we're talking about is we have like a center hub where the corrections officers and sort of the operational stuff that goes on in the jail takes place, and then there are pods surrounding it. Direct supervision by staff. The aims of this podular design is to decrease inmate violence, improve relationships and securities, and can be less costly, primarily due to lower lawsuits, less violence, less chance of lawsuits. Slide number 13, innovations in jail operations. Community jails are devised to aid reentry. Well, let's think about what jails do. Well, jails incapacitate. But if we're talking about jails, the maximum sentence is 1 year. So after about 1 year, what's going to happen? They're going to come back into society. They've paid their debt to society. So we have to try and prepare them. One of the things that I continually say is that one of the aims of the criminal justice system in total is to make a person better once they've exited than when they entered into it. So extend programs. These can be programs, life skills. These can be drug rehab programs. These can be educational or vocational programs. Intermediate sanctions allow offenders to remain in the community and ease jail overcrowding. So instead of sentencing a person to, let's say, 1 full year in a jail, Rikers Island. Well, maybe we'll do something like weekend programs. Maybe this person is the primary caregiver and breadwinner of their family. So to incarcerate them fully for 1 year, what happens? Well, now not only are we impacting the person that committed the offense and was convicted of the offense, we're now impacting their family as well. So maybe we allow them to work Monday through Friday, but Saturdays and Sundays they'll spend in jail. Electronic monitoring, that would probably go hand in hand with weekend programs as well. Community services, anytime you see someone on the highway, like in an orange jumpsuit, cleaning the highways, well, that's community service. Jail reentry programs are interlaced with probation and parole agencies. In a later chapter, we're going to talk about probation, we're going to talk about parole. Combined supervision, court supervision, in this case either the probation officer and or the parole officer, with care for offenders' needs. So because a person has been sentenced to probation, or a person had served some of their sentence and was offered parole as an option, doesn't mean that they get to hang out 24 hours a day. Their day is sort of charted out for them. Jails as short-term institutions. Short-term jails, facilities where both pretrial and sentenced inmates are confined. We've said this already. So if someone is pretrial, that person is considered to be a detainee. They have not been convicted of an offense, and there's actually still a presumption of innocence. Hold inmates sentenced for up to a year. Lockups hold people for anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. This is sort of that traditional drunk tank kind of thinking. Recommended to use as little as possible. I don't even really care that you know that or you don't know that. This is interesting. Booking areas are where intake occurs. Now, if you remember in the introduction to Law and Justice, that very last slide, I talked about central booking. Well, that is the booking area, and that is the transition from police custody to court custody. And included in that court's custody is correctional custody. Greater risks requires an attentive staff. You always have to be attentive. Sally ports allow staff to bring vehicles close to the administration area. Just as an aside, there is also when a police officer brings a perpetrator to central booking, he or she is not allowed to have their firearm on them, so they have to actually lock their firearm. And one of the things that they'll do is they'll unholster, put it into a sally port, unload, and then put it into the locker. Booking female inmates requires additional training and caution. Most jail staff tend to be male, and there can be liability issues. In today's day and age, I would also counter that not only is additional training required of female inmates, but there also needs to be much more training in gender inclusivity. Uh, a person decides what their gender is and what makes them feel comfortable in their skin, and correction staff have to deal with that. And one of the issues right now that's going on in the country is, how do we incarcerate someone? Do we incarcerate them via biology or via gender? It's an issue. It's something to think about. Informational technology and integration. Currently, there is little integration and sharing of systems between agencies. I can tell you that the urban centers are starting to get better at that. New York City, in particular, NYPD has their own databases. The New York City Department of Correction has its own database. The DOC is really good with their databases on gangs, so there is a sharing of information and intelligence there. Integrated data will help streamline info on inmates. If anyone is interested, you can YouTube New York City's real-time crime center. I believe that there is a BBC special, I think it's about 16 minutes long, about the real-time crime center and what it does. And basically what that does is it consolidates information into usable data for investigators. Jails as long-term facilities. Jails are normally designed for short-term sentences, but increasingly used for long-term sentences because longer jail sentences, and here's the real issue, or was the issue, state prisons were starting to get overcrowded. So in an attempt to not overcrowd them, they would bring these inmates back down to the city-county level into a jail. Let's skip to slide number 21. Jails as overflow facilities for a fee. Now, one of the issues that has been discussed is the idea of private prisons versus public prisons. I don't believe there's too many private prisons now operating anymore, but sheriffs contract out jails to other jurisdictions for a profit. Now, this is an interesting idea, whether you agree with it or not. Is government in the business of generating a profit, or is the government in the business of breaking even? Just something to think about. Critics cite that this creates a dependency on incarcerating people to obtain more of these funds. Proponents say that it helps costs and increase revenues. That's really up to you to deal with as an issue and where you fall in it. Jails and immigration detention. Agreement with local law enforcement and immigration and customs enforcement. As everyone is, I'm pretty sure, aware right now, there is a very major sort of social unrest about this issue. And a lot of urban centers are deciding to not cooperate with ICE, for better or worse. Slide number 24, jail overcrowding and the matrix classification system. Overcrowding can lead to lawsuits. Construction requires funding also through bonds, which requires a vote. I don't really care about the Oregon thing. Least dangerous offenders are normally released first in a means to sort of ease this issue of overcrowding. I'm at slide number 25, healthcare in jails. One of the things that we have to start thinking about is a lot of people who don't know too much about what the correctional system is and what it does think, all right, well, this person got convicted, let's lock them up and throw away the key. That is definitely not the case, especially if you buy my assertion that one of the aims of the criminal justice system is that a person exits better than when they entered. Well, we have to take care of them. So healthcare in jails. Jails offer one of the largest healthcare systems in the United States. So a person who might on the outside not have access to healthcare does have access to healthcare on the quote unquote inside, in jail, in prison. More than a third of all inmates report some medical problem. This could be anything from high blood pressure. This could be diabetes. It could be worse. It could be more than that. Cardiac issues, cancer issues, things of that nature. Obviously, elderly have more health issues than their younger counterparts. Female inmates have more health issues, and probably, I think it's chapter 10 or 12, we're going to actually talk about women in the correctional system. And one of the issues that we have to deal with when we're talking about female inmates is this idea that a significant amount of female inmates enter the correctional system pregnant, which means they're probably going to give birth. And what do we do then? Obviously, we have to provide hospital care not just for the mother, but for the baby as well. And then there are a whole host of issues. Well, what do we do? Are we separating families? Are we not separating families? Jails must take thorough precautions regarding communicable diseases. Now, when this was written, this was probably talking more about sexually transmitted diseases, but obviously talking in today's day and age, where probably the main issue right now would be the coronavirus, which is why there was a big push in a lot of the major urban centers to clear out the jails in an attempt to sort of slow that down. The last thing, one of the last issues that we're going to talk about is jail training standards. Training tools by the National Institution of Corrections and the American Jail Association. In order to be a corrections officer, more often than not, you have to go through an academy. That academy can be anywhere from 1 month to 6 months. I believe in the New York City Department of Corrections, I think they have a 3 or 4 month academy training. It is on the job training. Well, there is classroom training, and then there is sort of scenario based training, and then they actually do quote unquote field training inside the jails. Some of the things that, some of the trainings that a correction officer must go through, and this is not just corrections recruits, but once you have graduated and have become a correction officer, you continue to go to different trainings. Language, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, staff selection, communication skills, procedural justice, things of that nature. Um, Dealing with the challenges faced by female staff. And I would counter that if there is a jail system that is just a female jail, there needs to be additional training. And there usually is for male corrections officers in how to deal with female inmates. Compensation and career incentives, and evolving professionalism. One of the things that I always teach any of my recruits is that you don't have to be nice. You don't have to be a nice police officer. You don't have to be a nice corrections officer. What you have to be is professional, meaning that you're going to issue commands. And if you're going to issue commands, they are fair, they are impartial. You're not showing favor from one inmate to another, and that they are both legally and procedurally correct. Specialized sentence, types of jail sentences, we've already sort of talked about this. If we're awaiting a trial, people awaiting trial are always presumed innocent until proven guilty, We talked about this idea of weekend confinement and community work off orders. What we didn't talk about was shock incarceration and split sentences. Basically, a split sentence is exactly what you think of it. We're going to split it between being incarcerated and not being incarcerated. These shock programs, and we'll talk more about that in a later chapter, these are more boot camp style incarceration techniques. They have some good success, although there is a push moving away from that. The last thing that we're going to talk about is special issues in jail. Substance abuse. 68% of all jail inmates report substance abuse or dependence problems. So one of the things that if they are a substance abuser and they get arrested and they are confined, they are detained, or they have been convicted and they are in jail and or prison, one of the things that we as the criminal justice system has to do is detox them. And sometimes it's not just as easy to do cold turkey, meaning that, all right, we have a heroin user, we're just going to let it work its way out. That detox process takes a very hard toll on the body. There have been reported fatalities by detoxing. So again, cruel and unusual punishment, Eighth Amendment constitutional issues kick in here. We want to make this we know we have to detox them off heroin, but we have to make them comfortable. We have to do it in as humane a way as possible. Mental health issues. 64% of all jail inmates have some sort of mental health problem. This could be just general anxiety to more focused disorders, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, things of that nature. So not only do we have to provide prescription drugs, but there has to probably be some sort of therapeutic component with this as well. The jail suicide rate, and suicide rates are starting to increase in the general population anyway, but the rate of suicide in jail is 3 times that when a person has been incarcerated in either jail or prison. So one of the things, harkening back to correctional training, is that corrections officers have to be vigilant in observing protocols and observing these inmates and being able to observe signs of a person that might be suicidal. These could be verbal cues, these can be nonverbal cues, but they have to be vigilant because no one wants a suicide in their jail. No one really wants suicide to begin with, but again, this is just issues that we have to deal with. Well, that was chapter 4. I thank you for your time. Have a great day.